They say the mountains remember, and I know this to be true because I was there the night we made 14 men disappear into stone and shadow, leaving nothing behind but whispers and terror that echo through these canyons even now, decades after the last scream faded into silence. My name is Gray Fox, and I am Chiricahua Apache, nephew to the great Cochise, the man the Mexicans and the Americans feared more than death itself, the leader who could move through these mountains like smoke on the wind, who could strike without warning and vanish without trace, who held the Dragoon Mountains as his fortress and his sanctuary for decades against enemies who outnumbered us 100 to 1. What I am about to tell you is not a story of a great battle, not a tale of warriors charging into gunfire with war cries and courage, not a narrative of heroic last stands or glorious victories. This is a story of something darker, something that the white men who survived, and there were a few who lived to tell fragments of it, though their minds were broken by what they witnessed, called the Ghost Trail, the place where men went into the Dragoon Mountains and never came out, where the rocks themselves seemed to swallow the living, where the spirits of the dead took their revenge on those who had disturbed their rest, where fear became a weapon more deadly than any rifle or any blade. I was 19 summers old in the spring of 1861, a young warrior who had proven himself in raids against the Mexicans to the south, who had learned the ways of war from the greatest fighters our people had ever known, who had been trained since childhood in the arts of tracking and hunting and moving through hostile territory without being seen or heard. I had been born in these mountains, in a hidden canyon where my mother had given birth to me during a winter storm, and I had grown up knowing every rock and every spring, every cave and every trail, every place where water could be found, and every place where an enemy could be ambushed. I had learned to read the land the way other men read books, had been taught that the Dragoon Mountains were not just our home, but our fortress, our sanctuary, the place where we could always retreat when our enemies grew too strong, the place where we held every advantage and where no enemy could follow us without dying. The Dragoons rose from the desert floor like the spine of some ancient sleeping giant, a range of granite peaks and deep canyons that stretched for 50 miles across the southeastern corner of what the whites called Arizona Territory. The mountains were harsh and unforgiving, with little water and less mercy for those who did not know their secrets. In summer, the sun beat down on the rocks until they were too hot to touch, and the temperature in the canyons could reach heights that would kill a man in hours if he had no water. In winter, snow fell on the high peaks, and the nights were cold enough to freeze a man to death if he had no shelter. But for those who knew the mountains, for those who had been born here and raised here and taught the secrets that had been passed down through generations, the Dragoons were paradise, a place of hidden springs and sheltered canyons, of game and plants and everything needed to sustain life. The Dragoons were sacred to us, not just because they protected us, but because they held the bones of our ancestors, the burial sites where generations of Chiricahua had been laid to rest, where the spirits of the dead watched over the living, where the boundary between this world and the next was thin and permeable. We had specific places in the mountains where we buried our dead, places that were chosen with great care according to traditions that stretched back to the beginning of time, places that were protected by taboos and by fear, places that no Apache would disturb, and that we believed no enemy would dare to violate, because to do so was to invite the wrath of the spirits, to upset the balance between the living and the dead, to bring disaster not just on oneself, but on one's entire people. The burial sites were not marked in ways that outsiders would recognize. We did not build monuments or place stones or create any visible sign that would draw attention to these sacred places. Instead, we buried our dead in caves or in crevices in the rocks, wrapping them in deerskin or in blankets, placing with them the things they would need in the afterlife: weapons for the warriors, tools for the women, toys for the children. We sealed the burial sites with rocks and with prayers, and we performed ceremonies to ensure that the spirits of the dead would rest peacefully, that they would not wander, that they would watch over the living and protect them from harm. To disturb these burial sites was the worst offense imaginable in Apache culture, worse than murder, worse than theft, worse than any insult or injury to the living. The dead were sacred, and to disturb them was to invite disaster, to anger the spirits in a way that could bring catastrophe on the entire people, to create an imbalance in the cosmos that could only be corrected through the most serious and solemn rituals. We believed that the spirits of the dead had power, that they could help the living or harm them, that they demanded respect and honor, and that to fail to give them that respect was to court destruction. We were wrong to think that the white men would understand this, would respect our beliefs, would honor our sacred places. We were wrong to think that anything was sacred to them except their own desires, their own greed, their own hunger for wealth and power. The white men came to our land in increasing numbers after they discovered silver in the mountains to the east, after they built their towns and their mines and their roads, after they decided that everything in this land belonged to them by right of their presence, by right of their guns, by right of their belief that they were superior to everyone else, and that their desires mattered more than our lives, or our sacred places, or our right to exist. Most of them stayed away from the heart of the dragoons because they had heard the stories, because they knew that Cochise controlled these mountains, because they understood that to enter Apache territory was to risk death. My uncle had made that clear through years of warfare, through raids and ambushes and demonstrations of power, that left no doubt that the dragoons belonged to the Apache, and that any who entered without permission would pay with their lives. But there are always men who are too greedy or too foolish or too arrogant to listen to warnings, men who believe that the rules that apply to others do not apply to them, men who think that their rifles and their numbers and their confidence will protect them from any danger. And in the spring of 1861, 14 such men came into our mountains. They were miners, prospectors looking for silver, men who had heard rumors of rich deposits in the dragoons, men who believed that the potential reward was worth the risk. Their leader was a man named Jacob Walters, a big man with a red beard and a loud voice, a man who had made and lost several fortunes in mining camps across the West, a man who was convinced that this time would be different, that this time he would strike it rich and retire wealthy. He had gathered 13 other men, a mix of experienced miners and desperate fortune seekers, men who were willing to risk their lives for the chance at wealth, men who either did not know or did not care that they were entering forbidden territory. They came with picks and shovels and dynamite, with mules loaded with supplies, with rifles and pistols, and the confidence of men who had never truly faced an enemy who knew how to fight in the mountains. They entered the dragoons from the east, following a canyon that led deep into the heart of the range, and they set up a camp in a place that we called the Place of the Ancient Ones, a canyon where our people had buried their dead for generations, a place that was so sacred that even we approached it with caution and respect, with prayers and offerings, with the understanding that we were walking on ground that belonged to the spirits. The canyon was beautiful in the way that the desert is beautiful, harsh and stark and unforgiving, but also magnificent in its austerity. The walls rose hundreds of feet on either side, layers of red and grey granite that had been carved by water and wind over millions of years. A small stream ran through the center of the canyon, fed by springs higher in the mountains, providing water year-round, which was why our ancestors had chosen this place for burials. The presence of water meant that the spirits of the dead would never thirst, that they would be comfortable in their rest. Cottonwood trees grew along the stream, providing shade, and there were caves in the canyon walls where the burial sites were located, caves that were hidden and protected and sacred. The miners did not know this, or perhaps they knew and did not care. They saw rocks and dirt and the possibility of silver, and they began to dig. They set up their camp near the stream, built their fires, unpacked their supplies, and began to explore the canyon, looking for signs of silver ore, tapping on rocks with their hammers, examining every outcrop and every vein of quartz. And when their exploration led them to one of the caves in the canyon wall, when they entered it with their torches and their tools, they found one of our burial sites. I was not there when it happened, but I heard the story later from the scouts who had been watching them, who had seen everything and reported back to Cochise. The miners had entered the cave and found the remains of one of our warriors, a man who had been buried perhaps 50 years earlier, wrapped in deerskin and laid to rest with his weapons and his possessions. The body had been mummified by the dry air of the cave, preserved so well that the features were still recognizable, the skin dried and leathery but intact, and with the body were the things that had been buried with him. A bow and arrows, a lance with a stone point, a war club decorated with feathers, and most significantly, jewelry made of turquoise and silver. Ornaments that had been precious to the warrior in life, and that had been placed with him so that he would have them in the afterlife. The miners saw the jewelry and the weapons, and they saw not a sacred burial site, but a source of treasure, a cache of valuable items that they could take and sell. They did not stop to consider what they were doing, did not pause to think about the significance of what they had found, did not show any respect for the dead or any understanding that they were violating something sacred. Instead, they looted the burial site, taking the turquoise and the silver ornaments and the weapons, treating our ancestor like a curiosity, like a source of treasure, like a thing that had no more significance than rocks in the ground. And then, because the burial site was in a part of the cave where they thought there might be silver ore, because they wanted to get to the rock beneath it, because they were impatient and greedy and utterly without respect, they used dynamite to blast the cave apart, to destroy what they could not loot, to obliterate the burial site so completely that nothing would remain. The explosion echoed through the mountains like thunder, a deep boom that seemed to come from the heart of the earth itself, that seemed to shake the very foundations of the world. I heard it from our camp 5 miles away, where I was sitting outside my wickiup working on a new bow, carefully shaping the wood and testing its flexibility. The sound reached me like a physical blow, and I looked up, startled, my hands freezing in their work. The sound was wrong, unnatural, not the sound of thunder or rockfall or any natural phenomenon, but something else, something that carried with it a sense of violation and desecration. I saw my uncle Cochise standing at the entrance to his wickiup, his face turned toward the sound, his expression unreadable, but his body tense, alert, like a wolf that has caught the scent of danger. He stood motionless for a long moment, listening, and I could see the other warriors emerging from their wickiups, could see the women stopping their work, could see everyone in the camp turning toward the sound, trying to understand what it meant. Within minutes, scouts came running into camp, their faces showing shock and rage, their words tumbling over each other as they tried to explain what they had seen. White men in the place of the ancient ones, digging, exploring the caves, finding one of the burial sites, looting it, taking the sacred objects, and then, most horrifying of all, using their explosives to destroy the cave, to blast apart the burial site, to scatter the bones of our ancestor across the rocks like so much debris. I watched Cochise's face as he listened to the scouts, and I saw something in his eyes that I had never seen before, something that was colder and darker than anger, something that was beyond rage, something that seemed to come from a place so deep and so primal that it was almost inhuman. His face remained impassive, but his eyes burned with a fury that was all the more terrible because it was controlled, because it was focused, because it was not the hot rage that burns out quickly, but the cold rage that endures, that plans, that waits for the perfect moment to strike. The desecration of burial sites was the worst offense imaginable in Apache culture, worse than murder, worse than theft, worse than any insult or injury to the living. The dead were sacred, and to disturb them was to invite disaster, to upset the balance between this world and the next, to anger the spirits in a way that could bring catastrophe on the entire people. We believed that when the dead were disturbed, when their rest was violated, their spirits became restless and angry, that they would wander the earth seeking vengeance, that they would bring misfortune and death to the living until their rest was restored and the violation was avenged. Cochise did not shout or rage or call for immediate war. He stood in silence for a long moment, his face carved from stone, his eyes distant, as if he were looking at something far away or deep within himself. And then he turned and walked into his wickiup, and we knew that he was going to pray, to seek guidance from the spirits, to consult with the powers that guided our people, to decide what must be done. We waited outside, dozens of warriors gathered in the center of the camp, speaking in low voices, our anger building, our desire for revenge growing with each passing moment. I stood with the other young warriors, and I felt a rage building in me that was unlike anything I had ever experienced. I had fought Mexicans and had killed them without remorse, because they were our enemies, and because warfare was part of life, part of the natural order of things. But this was different. This was not warfare. This was sacrilege. This was a violation so profound that it seemed to tear at the very fabric of reality, to upset the balance between the living and the dead, to threaten not just our people, but the cosmic order itself. When Cochise emerged from his wickiup an hour later, his face was painted for war, but not in the usual way. Instead of the bright reds and blacks that we normally wore into battle, his face was painted with white clay, the color of death, the color of ghosts, the color of the spirit world. The white paint covered his entire face, making him look like a skull, like death itself walking among the living. It was a sign that what was to come was not ordinary warfare, not a raid for horses or supplies or revenge in the usual sense, but something else, something darker, something that belonged to the realm of the spirits as much as to the realm of the living. He called for the council of warriors, and we gathered around him in a circle, and he spoke in a voice that was quiet, but that carried to every man present, a voice that seemed to come from somewhere deep within him, a voice that carried the weight of generations, the authority of the spirits themselves. He said, "The white men have committed the worst sacrilege. They have disturbed the sleep of our ancestors. They have looted the graves of our fathers and grandfathers. They have taken the sacred objects that were meant to accompany the dead into the afterlife. They have used their explosives to destroy what should never be touched, to scatter the bones of our ancestors like dust in the wind. This cannot be answered with a raid or a battle. This cannot be answered with the ordinary ways of war. These men must disappear. They must vanish from the earth as if they never existed. They must become a warning to all who would follow them, a story that will be told in whispers, a tale that will make men afraid to enter our mountains, a legend that will protect our sacred places long after we are gone." He paused, and his eyes moved across the gathered warriors, and I felt his gaze rest on me for a moment, felt as if he were looking into my soul, measuring me, judging whether I was ready for what was to come. And then he continued, "I will choose a small group to do this work, not a war party, but a hunting party. You will not fight these men in open battle. You will not give them the honor of a warrior's death. You will hunt them one by one, using the mountains and the darkness and their own fear as your weapons. You will make them disappear so completely that no one will ever know what happened to them. You will make it seem as if the mountains themselves have swallowed them, as if the spirits of the dead have taken their revenge, as if the very earth has opened up and consumed them for their sacrilege. And when you are done, when all 14 are gone, you will leave signs that will make the white men understand that this place is forbidden, that to disturb our dead is to invite a fate worse than death." He looked directly at me, and he said, "Grey Fox, you will be part of this hunting party. You know these mountains better than most. You move silently. You think before you act. You understand patience. You will help make these men disappear." I felt a chill run through me, not from fear, but from the weight of what he was asking, from the understanding that this would not be ordinary warfare, that this would be something darker, something that would require not just courage but cunning, not just strength but patience, not just the willingness to kill, but the ability to do so in ways that would terrify rather than simply defeat, that would create a legend rather than simply eliminate an enemy. Cochise chose 7 warriors in total, a small group that could move quickly and silently, that could live off the land for weeks if necessary, that could strike and vanish without leaving a trace, that could work together with the precision and coordination that this mission would require. Besides myself, he chose Nietzsche, his own son, a warrior of 22 summers, who had already proven himself in many battles, who was known for his speed and his skill with the knife, who moved like a shadow and struck like a snake. He chose Geronimo, who was not yet the famous leader he would become, but who was already known as a man of powerful medicine, a man who could see things that others could not see, who could move through enemy territory as if protected by the spirits, who had visions that guided him and gave him knowledge that seemed to come from beyond the physical world. He chose Je, a massive warrior who stood nearly 6.5 feet tall and weighed over 200 pounds, a man of incredible strength who could break a man's neck with his bare hands, who could carry a wounded comrade for miles without tiring, who was known for his ability to fight in close combat and his utter fearlessness in battle. He chose Victorio, A tactical genius who could read terrain and predict enemy movements with uncanny accuracy, who could look at a landscape and immediately see every advantage and every danger, who could plan an ambush or an escape route with the precision of a master craftsman. He chose Nana, an older warrior who had fought the Mexicans for decades and who knew every trick of guerrilla warfare, every way to use terrain and weather and darkness to advantage, every method of creating fear and confusion in an enemy, every technique for making a small force seem like a large one, or for making a large force disappear completely. And he chose Mangus, the son of the great chief Mangus Coloradus, a young warrior of my own age who was eager to prove himself, who carried the weight of his father's reputation, and who was determined to live up to it, who was known for his skill with the bow and his ability to track game or enemies across any terrain. We were 7, and we would hunt 14, and we would do it in a way that would create a legend that would last for generations. We spent 2 days in preparation, but our preparation was different from the usual rituals before a raid. We did not paint ourselves with bright colors or sing war songs or dance to build our courage. Instead, we painted ourselves with white clay and gray ash, the colors of ghosts and shadows, the colors of death and the spirit world. We covered our entire bodies with the paint, making ourselves look like corpses, like spirits, like things that were not quite alive and not quite dead. We painted our horses as well, covering them with the same white clay and gray ash, making them look like ghost horses, like spirit animals that belong to the world of the dead rather than the world of the living. We fasted for 2 days, eating nothing, drinking only water, emptying ourselves of all physical desires, all ordinary concerns, all thoughts of anything except the mission that lay ahead. Fasting was a way of purifying ourselves, of making ourselves fit vessels for the power of the spirits, of demonstrating to the ancestors that we were serious, that we were willing to sacrifice, that we were not motivated by ordinary desires for glory or plunder, but by a higher purpose, by the need to avenge their desecration and to restore the balance between the living and the dead. We prayed constantly during those 2 days, asking the spirits of our ancestors to guide us, to give us the power to avenge their desecration, to help us move unseen and strike without warning, to protect us from our enemies' weapons, to give us the cunning and the patience and the ruthlessness that this mission would require. We prayed to the mountain spirits, asking them to hide us and to help us, to make the rocks and the shadows our allies, to turn the very landscape into a weapon against our enemies. We prayed to the spirits of the animals, asking them to lend us their abilities, the silence of the owl, the patience of the spider, the cunning of the coyote, the ferocity of the mountain lion. Geronimo performed a ceremony, calling on his power, seeking visions that would guide us. He sat alone in a cave for an entire day and night, fasting and praying and singing. And when he emerged, his eyes had a distant look, as if he were seeing things that existed in another world, another dimension of reality. He told us that the spirits were angry, that they demanded vengeance, that they would help us if we honored them properly. He said that we should not kill the miners quickly or cleanly, that we should make them suffer, that we should make them afraid, that we should make their deaths a warning to all who would follow them, a demonstration of what happened to those who disturbed the dead. He said that the spirits had shown him visions of how we should proceed, that we should kill the miners one by one over many days, that we should use different methods each time, that we should create a pattern of terror that would grow with each death, that would make the survivors increasingly afraid, increasingly desperate, increasingly aware that they were being hunted by something they could not fight, could not escape, could not even understand. He said that we should make them believe that the mountains themselves were killing them, that the spirits of the dead were taking their revenge, that they were being punished for their sacrilege by forces beyond the physical world. We gathered specific plants and minerals that we would use to create fear in our enemies. We collected datura, a plant that caused powerful hallucinations when burned or ingested, that could make a man see things that were not there, hear voices that did not exist, believe that he was being attacked by demons or spirits or monsters. We collected minerals that could be ground into powder and left in places where the miners would find them, substances that would make them sick or disoriented or terrified. We collected plants that could be used to poison water or food, that would cause pain and suffering and death, that would make the miners believe that the very land itself was turning against them. We also prepared our weapons with special care. We sharpened our knives until they could cut through leather as easily as cloth. We selected our best arrows and checked each one for straightness and balance, and we tipped them with points that had been treated with poison from the glands of certain toads, poison that would cause agonizing pain and eventual death even from a minor wound. We prepared our war clubs, wrapping the handles with fresh leather for better grip, checking the stone heads to ensure they were securely attached. We checked our rifles and our ammunition, though we knew that we would use guns sparingly because the sound of gunfire would alert our enemies and would rob us of the element of surprise that was our greatest advantage. On the third day, we left the camp and moved into the mountains, traveling light, carrying only our weapons and a small amount of food, relying on our knowledge of the land to sustain us. We moved silently, using trails that only the Apache knew, ancient paths that had been used by our people for generations, trails that were invisible to outsiders, that followed the contours of the land in ways that made sense only to those who understood the mountains intimately. We avoided the main paths, stayed in the shadows, moved during the hours when the light was dim and the shadows were long, becoming part of the landscape invisible to any who might be watching. We reached the canyon where the miners had made their camp by late afternoon of the third day, and we found positions on the ridge above them where we could watch without being seen. We lay flat on the rocks, our bodies covered with the white clay and grey ash that made us blend into the granite, and we watched the miners below, studying them, learning their routines, identifying their strengths and their weaknesses, planning how we would kill them. There were 14 of them, just as the scouts had reported. They had set up their camp in the center of the canyon, near the stream, near the burial site they had destroyed. We could see the crater where they had used dynamite, could see the scattered bones and the torn deerskin wrappings, could see the artifacts they had looted piled carelessly near their tents, treated like common objects, like things of no significance. The sight of it filled me with a cold rage, a fury that was all the more intense because it was controlled, because I knew that I could not simply charge down the hill and attack them, that I had to be patient, had to wait for the right moment, had to follow the plan that Cochise had laid out. We watched them for the rest of that day and into the night, learning everything we could about them. We counted them multiple times to make sure of the number. We identified their leader, the big man with the red beard, Jacob Walters, who seemed to be in charge, who gave orders that the others followed, who carried himself with the confidence of a man who believed he was in control of the situation. We identified their sentries, noting that they posted 2 men on watch at night, that they changed the watch every few hours, that the sentries were not particularly alert, that they sat by the fire and talked and sometimes dozed, clearly not expecting any real danger. We noted their weapons. Each man had a rifle, and most also carried pistols, and they had ammunition and powder in abundance. We noted their supplies. They had food for several weeks, had tools and equipment for mining, had tents and blankets, and everything they needed for an extended stay in the mountains. We noted their horses and mules, perhaps 20 animals in total, hobbled near the camp, a source of transportation, and also a source of food if they ran short of supplies. We noted their routines. They rose at dawn, cooked breakfast over their fire, spent the day exploring the canyon and digging in various places, looking for signs of silver ore. They worked in groups of 3 or 4, never alone, which showed some caution but which also meant that they were predictable, that we could anticipate where they would be and what they would be doing at any given time. They returned to camp in the late afternoon, cooked dinner, sat around the fire talking and laughing and drinking whiskey, and then went to sleep in their tents, leaving only the 2 sentries awake. They were confident, even careless, clearly not expecting any trouble, clearly believing that they were safe in their camp with their rifles and their numbers. They laughed and joked, told stories, argued about where to dig next, discussed how they would spend their money when they struck it rich. They were ordinary men, not particularly evil or cruel, just greedy and ignorant, men who had no understanding of what they had done, no comprehension of the sacrilege they had committed, no awareness that they had signed their own death warrants the moment they had disturbed the burial site. We watched them, and we felt no pity, no hesitation, no doubt about what we were going to do. They had violated the sacred and they would pay the price. It was that simple, that clear, that inevitable. We struck for the first time just after midnight, when the camp was quiet and most of the miners were asleep. 2 of them were on sentry duty, sitting by the fire, talking in low voices, their rifles leaning against a rock nearby. They were not particularly alert, were more focused on their conversation than on watching for danger, were clearly going through the motions of standing watch without really believing that anything would happen. Nietzsche and I were chosen for this first kill because we were the youngest and the fastest, because we could move with absolute silence, because we had trained for years in the art of approaching an enemy without being detected. We crept down from the ridge, moving so slowly and so carefully that it took us nearly an hour to cover the 200 yards between our position and their camp. We moved when the wind blew, using the sound of the wind in the trees and the gurgling of the stream to mask any small sounds we might make. We froze when the wind was still, becoming part of the landscape, invisible in the darkness. We used every rock and every bush as cover, staying in the deepest shadows, moving only when we were certain that the sentries were not looking in our direction. We reached the edge of the firelight, perhaps 20 feet from where the 2 sentries sat, and we waited, watching them, timing their movements, waiting for the perfect moment. One of them stood and stretched, said something to his companion about needing to relieve himself, and walked away from the fire toward the edge of the camp. This was the moment we had been waiting for, the moment when they were separated, when we could strike at one without the other immediately knowing. Nietzsche moved first, and I marveled at his speed and his silence. He crossed the distance between us and the remaining sentry in 3 strides that made no sound at all, his moccasins touching the ground as lightly as falling leaves. His knife flashed in the firelight, and his hand clamped over the man's mouth to prevent any sound. The sentry's eyes went wide with shock and terror, and he struggled for a moment, his hands reaching up to try to pull Nietzsche's hand away from his mouth, his body convulsing as Nietzsche's knife found his throat and opened it with a single precise cut. Blood poured from the wound, black in the firelight, and the man's struggles weakened and then stopped, and Nietzsche lowered him silently to the ground. I moved toward the second sentry, who was still standing at the edge of the camp with his back to us, and I killed him the same way, quickly and silently, my knife finding his throat, my hand over his mouth, his life ending before he even understood what was happening, before he could make a sound that would alert his companions. I felt his body go limp in my arms, felt the warmth of his blood on my hands, felt a grim satisfaction that the hunt had begun, that the first payment had been made for the desecration of our sacred place. We dragged both bodies away from the fire, into the darkness, and we carried them up the ridge to where the others were waiting. This was hard work because the bodies were heavy and the slope was steep, but we managed it without making any sound that would carry to the camp below. When we reached the top of the ridge, Geronimo and Victorio helped us arrange the bodies in a specific way, positioning them so that they were facing the burial site they had desecrated, placing stones over their eyes and mouths in the Apache way of dealing with the dead, creating a tableau that would have meaning to anyone who understood Apache beliefs about death and the spirit world. But we also did something else, something that Geronimo had suggested, something that was designed to create fear and confusion. We painted symbols on the rocks near the bodies, symbols that looked like they might have religious or magical significance, but that were actually meaningless, that were designed simply to make the miners think that some kind of ritual or curse had been performed. We scattered white powder around the bodies, powder made from ground gypsum that looked like it might be some kind of magical substance. We arranged small stones in circles and lines that suggested patterns, but that actually meant nothing. We were creating a scene that would terrify the miners when they found it, that would make them think they were dealing with something beyond their understanding, something supernatural, something that could not be fought with rifles and courage. And then we left the bodies there, on the ridge above the camp, where they would be found in the morning, and we returned to our hiding places and waited for dawn. When the sun rose and the miners began to wake, it took them several minutes to realize that their 2 sentries were missing. We watched as confusion turned to concern, as concern turned to alarm, as they began to search the area, calling out the names of the missing men. "Tom, Charlie, where are you?" Their voices growing more urgent as they received no answer, And then one of them, a thin man with a nervous manner, looked up at the ridge and saw the bodies, and we heard his shout of horror, heard the panic in his voice as he called the others. The miners gathered at the base of the ridge, staring up at the bodies of their companions, and we could see the fear on their faces, could see them beginning to understand that they were not safe, that something was hunting them. Some of them wanted to leave immediately, wanted to pack up and get out of the canyon, and we could hear them arguing, their voices carrying clearly in the morning air. But their leader, Jacob Walters, the man with the red beard, convinced them to stay, arguing that it was just Indians, that they had rifles and numbers, that they could defend themselves if they stayed together and stayed alert, that they had come too far and invested too much to give up now just because of a couple of dead men. He was wrong, but his confidence and his authority kept them in the canyon for another day, and that was all we needed. If they had left immediately, if they had abandoned their camp and their equipment and fled, we might have let some of them go, might have been satisfied with killing just the two. But they stayed, and by staying, they sealed their fate. Over the next 2 weeks, we killed them one by one, using different methods each time, creating a pattern of terror that grew with each death, that made the survivors increasingly afraid, increasingly desperate, increasingly aware that they were being hunted by something they could not fight, could not escape, could not even understand. We killed the third man on the second day, shooting him with an arrow while he was gathering water from the stream. He had gone alone, despite Walter's orders that no one should go anywhere alone, and he paid for his carelessness with his life. The arrow came from the rocks above the stream, striking him in the back, punching through his ribs and into his heart. He fell forward into the water, and his blood turned the stream red, and his body floated downstream until it caught on some rocks. The other miners found him an hour later, and they were terrified by the sight, by the arrow still protruding from his back, by the blood in the water, by the realization that they were being watched, that the enemy could strike at any time from any direction. We killed the fourth man that night, using a method that was designed to create maximum terror. We waited until he went to the edge of the camp to relieve himself, and then Ju, our strongest warrior, grabbed him from behind, clamping a hand over his mouth to prevent any sound, and carried him away into the darkness. We took him far from the camp, to a place where his screams would not be heard, and then we killed him slowly, making sure that his death was painful, making sure that he suffered, because Geronimo had said that the spirits demanded suffering, that the miners needed to pay not just with their lives, but with their pain and their fear. We left his body where it would be found, but we mutilated it in ways that were designed to terrify, cutting off his fingers and his ears, arranging them in patterns around the body, creating a scene that looked like some kind of ritual sacrifice. We painted more symbols on the rocks, scattered more white powder, left more signs that suggested supernatural forces at work. The miners found the body the next morning, and the effect was exactly what we had hoped for. Several of them vomited at the sight, others wept. They all argued, their voices rising in panic and fear, some demanding that they leave immediately, others insisting that they should stay and fight, others suggesting that they should try to negotiate, to offer gifts, to somehow appease whatever was hunting them. Walters tried to maintain order, tried to keep them together, but his authority was crumbling, his confidence shaken by the realization that his rifles and his numbers meant nothing against an enemy he could not see, could not fight, could not even find. We killed the fifth and sixth men on the third day, using poison. We had found their water supply, a spring that fed into the stream, and we poisoned it with a plant that caused violent hallucinations and convulsions, a plant that would make them see things that were not there, that would make them believe they were being attacked by demons or spirits or monsters. 2 of the miners drank from the poisoned water, and within hours they were writhing on the ground, screaming about things that only they could see, clawing at their own skin, fighting invisible enemies. The other miners tried to help them, tried to hold them down, tried to give them water and comfort, but there was nothing they could do. The 2 poisoned men died in agony, their bodies convulsing, their screams echoing through the canyon, and the effect on the survivors was devastating. They were terrified now, truly terrified, no longer just concerned or worried, but genuinely afraid for their lives. They stopped working in the mine. They stopped doing anything except huddling in their camp. their rifles in their hands, their eyes scanning the darkness, jumping at every sound, seeing enemies in every shadow. They built up their fire until it was a roaring blaze, as if the light could protect them, as if the flames could keep away whatever was hunting them. They prayed, some of them, calling on their God to protect them, to deliver them from evil, to save them from whatever nightmare they had stumbled into. But their God did not answer, or perhaps he did answer, and his answer was that they deserved what was happening to them, that they had violated sacred ground and now they were paying the price. We killed the seventh man on the fourth day using a trap. We set up a snare on a trail that led from the camp to a place where the miners had been digging, a rope that would catch a man's ankle and pull him up into a tree, leaving him hanging upside down, helpless and vulnerable. One of the miners walked into the trap, and the rope caught his ankle and yanked him into the air with such force that we heard his ankle break, heard his scream of pain and terror as he found himself hanging upside down from a tree branch, swinging back and forth, unable to reach the rope to cut himself down, unable to do anything except scream for help. His companions heard his screams and came running, and they found him hanging there, and they tried to cut him down, but we were waiting for them. We shot arrows from the rocks above, not trying to kill them, but trying to drive them back, trying to keep them away from their trapped companion. They fired their rifles at us, but they could not see us, could not hit what they could not see, and their bullets ricocheted off the rocks harmlessly. Eventually they retreated, leaving their companion hanging in the tree, and we waited until dark, and then we killed him, slowly and painfully, making sure his screams carried back to the camp, making sure his companions heard him die. By the end of the first week, 8 of the 14 miners were dead, and the remaining 6 were on the verge of complete panic. They had stopped sleeping, were taking turns staying awake all night, were so exhausted and so terrified that they were barely functional. They had stopped eating properly, because they were afraid that their food might be poisoned, because their stomachs were knotted with fear, because they had no appetite. They argued constantly, their voices rising in anger and desperation, blaming each other for their situation, accusing each other of cowardice or stupidity or bad luck. Walters, their leader, tried to maintain order, tried to keep them together, but his authority was gone, his confidence shattered. He looked like a man who had aged 10 years in a week, his face haggard, his eyes haunted, his hands shaking. He knew that he had made a terrible mistake, that he had led his men into a trap from which there was no escape, that he was responsible for their deaths. But he did not know how to fix it, did not know how to save them, did not know how to fight an enemy that seemed to be everywhere and nowhere, that struck without warning and vanished without trace. On the 8th night, 4 of them tried to escape. They could not take it anymore, could not endure another day of waiting to die, could not stand the constant fear and the sleeplessness and the knowledge that they were being hunted. They decided to make a run for it, to try to sneak out of the camp under cover of darkness and make their way out of the canyon, to get back to civilization, to escape whatever nightmare they had stumbled into. We were waiting for them. We had known they would try to run, had predicted the route they would take, had prepared an ambush in the narrow part of the canyon where the walls closed in and there was no room to maneuver, no way to escape, no possibility of fighting back effectively. Victorio had chosen the spot with his usual brilliance, a place where the canyon narrowed to perhaps 20 feet across, where the walls rose sheer on both sides, where there was no cover and no escape route, where we could attack from above with complete advantage. The 4 miners came creeping through the darkness, moving as quietly as they could, which was not very quietly at all, because they did not know how to move silently, did not understand that every footstep on loose gravel, every brush against a bush, every whispered word carried in the night air and announced their presence to anyone who knew how to listen. We heard them coming long before we saw them, tracked their progress through the canyon by sound alone, waited patiently for them to enter the killing zone. When they were in the narrowest part of the canyon, when they were directly below our positions, when there was no possibility of escape, we attacked. We did not use arrows or bullets, because we wanted to kill them silently, because we did not want to alert the miners back at the camp, because we wanted these 4 to simply disappear, to vanish as if they had never existed. Instead, we dropped rocks on them from above, large stones that we had positioned earlier, stones that fell with terrible force and accuracy, crushing skulls, breaking bones, killing instantly, or leaving the miners wounded and helpless on the canyon floor. And then we descended on them with our knives and our war clubs, finishing the work that the rocks had begun, killing them quickly and efficiently in the darkness. It was brutal work, close and personal, and I felt the spray of blood on my face, felt the impact of my war club against bone, felt the resistance and then the yielding as flesh and bone gave way under the force of my blows. I felt no pity, no remorse, no hesitation. These men had desecrated our sacred place, and they were paying the price, and I was simply the instrument of that justice, the tool that the spirits were using to restore the balance. When it was done, when all four lay dead on the canyon floor, we arranged their bodies in the same way we had arranged the others, facing the burial site, stones over their eyes and mouths, symbols painted on the rocks around them, white powder scattered in patterns that suggested ritual and magic and supernatural forces. And then we left them there in the narrow part of the canyon, where they would be found eventually, where they would add to the legend, where they would become part of the story that would keep people out of these mountains for years to come. That left only 2 miners in the camp, Jacob Walters, the red-bearded leader, and one other man, a young miner named Billy, who could not have been more than 20 years old, who had probably come west seeking adventure and fortune, and who had found only terror and death. We watched them from the ridge, watched as they realized that their 4 companions were not coming back, watched as the last remnants of hope drained from their faces, watched as they understood that they were alone, that everyone else was dead, that they were next. They did not try to run, they did not try to fight. They simply sat by their fire, huddled together like children afraid of the dark, their rifles across their laps, their eyes wide and staring, waiting for death to come for them. They did not speak. They did not move except to feed the fire, to keep it burning bright, as if the light could protect them, as if the flames could keep away the darkness and the death that waited in it. We could have killed them that night, could have ended it quickly, could have crept into their camp and cut their throats while they sat by the fire. But Geronimo said no, that we should wait one more day, that we should let their fear grow to its peak, that we should let them understand fully what they had done and what price they were paying for it, that we should give the spirits one more day to savor their revenge. So we waited. We watched them through the next day, watched as they sat by their fire without moving, without eating, without sleeping, simply waiting for death. The young one, Billy, wept at times, tears streaming down his face, his body shaking with sobs. The older one, Walters, sat in silence, his face like stone, his eyes empty. A man who had already died inside, who was simply waiting for his body to catch up with his spirit. As the sun began to set on the 9th day, as the shadows lengthened and the canyon filled with darkness, we made our final move. We did not creep or hide or approach with stealth. Instead, we simply walked into their camp, all 7 of us, appearing as if from nowhere, our faces painted white, our bodies covered in ash, moving silently, our weapons in our hands, looking like ghosts, like spirits, like death itself, come to claim them. The 2 miners saw us and froze. They did not reach for their rifles. They did not try to run. They did not do anything except stare at us with eyes that were beyond fear, beyond terror, beyond anything except a kind of numb acceptance. They knew they were going to die. They had known it for days, and now death had come for them, and there was nothing they could do except accept it. Walters spoke, his voice hoarse and broken. He said, "Just make it quick, please. We didn't know. We didn't understand. Just make it quick." But we did not make it quick. Geronimo stepped forward and spoke to them in Spanish, which many of the miners understood, and he told them why they were going to die. He told them about the burial site they had desecrated, about the sacred objects they had looted, about the bones they had scattered with their explosives. He told them that they had committed the worst sacrilege imaginable, that they had disturbed the sleep of the dead, that they had angered the spirits, that their deaths were not revenge but justice, not murder but restoration of balance. And then we killed them, not quickly, not cleanly, but slowly and deliberately, making them suffer as Geronimo had said the spirits demanded, making them pay not just with their lives but with their pain and their fear. I will not describe in detail what we did, because it was terrible, because it was brutal, because it was the darkest thing I have ever been part of. But I will say that when it was done, when both men were dead, I felt no satisfaction, no sense of victory, no joy. I felt only a kind of emptiness, a sense that something necessary had been done, but that the doing of it had cost us something, had taken something from us that we would never get back. We arranged their bodies with the others, completing the pattern, finishing the ceremony. And then we performed the final ritual, the one that Geronimo had planned from the beginning. We gathered all the bodies, all 14 of them, and we carried them to the burial site that they had desecrated, to the cave that they had destroyed with their dynamite. We arranged them in a circle around the crater, facing inward, facing the place where our ancestor had been laid to rest, and we positioned them so that they were kneeling as if in supplication, as if begging forgiveness for what they had done. We painted symbols on their bodies and on the rocks around them, symbols that told the story of what had happened, symbols that would be understood by any Apache who saw them, and that would be mysterious and terrifying to any white man who found them. We scattered white powder and arranged stones in patterns, and left signs that suggested powerful magic, supernatural forces, the wrath of the spirits made manifest. And then we gathered all the artifacts that the miners had looted from the burial site, all the turquoise and silver and weapons, and we returned them to the cave, reburying them with prayers and offerings, asking the spirits of our ancestors to forgive us for not protecting them better, asking them to accept these offerings and to rest peacefully once more. We performed a ceremony of purification, burning sacred plants, singing the old songs, praying to the spirits to restore the balance, to heal the wound that had been opened when the burial site was violated. We spent an entire day on this ceremony because it was important, because it was the whole point of what we had done, because the killing of the 14 miners was not an end in itself but a means to an end, a way of restoring the cosmic balance, a way of cleansing the desecration, a way of ensuring that the spirits of our ancestors could rest peacefully once more. When the ceremony was complete, when we had done everything that needed to be done, we destroyed the miners' camp. We burned their tents and their supplies, scattered their tools and their equipment, took their horses and mules and drove them out of the canyon and released them miles away. We took their rifles and ammunition, valuable prizes that would be useful in future fights. We erased every sign that they had ever been there, every trace of their presence, every indication that 14 men had come into this canyon seeking silver and had found only death. And then we left, moving back into the mountains, vanishing as completely as we had appeared, leaving behind nothing but bodies and mystery and terror. We returned to our camp, and we reported to Cochise what we had done, and he nodded in satisfaction and said that we had done well, that the spirits were pleased, that the balance had been restored. But I did not feel pleased. I felt hollow, empty, as if something inside me had died along with those 14 men. I had killed before, had killed Mexicans in raids, had killed enemies in battle, but this had been different. This had not been warfare in any ordinary sense. This had been something darker, something that belonged to the realm of the spirits as much as to the realm of the living, something that had required us to become instruments of forces beyond ourselves, to surrender our own humanity in service of a higher purpose. The bodies were found 3 weeks later by a group of soldiers who had been sent to investigate when the miners failed to return. The soldiers found the camp destroyed, found the bodies arranged in their circle around the burial site, found the signs and the symbols and the evidence of what had happened, and they were terrified. They did not stay long, did not investigate thoroughly, did not try to pursue us. They gathered what bodies they could find. They only found 10 of the 14, because we had hidden 4 of them in places where they would never be discovered, and they left the canyon as quickly as they could, and they told stories that grew in the telling, stories of ghosts and spirits, and mountains that swallowed men whole. The place became known as Ghost Canyon, and no white man would enter it for years afterward. The story of the 14 miners who disappeared became a legend, a cautionary tale told around campfires, a story that was embellished and exaggerated until it bore little resemblance to what had actually happened, but which served its purpose. It kept people out of our sacred places. It made them afraid of the Dragoon Mountains. It reminded them that there were some places that belonged to the Apache, and that to enter them was to invite death. The legend grew over the years. People said that the canyon was haunted, that the ghosts of the dead miners walked there at night, that you could hear their screams echoing off the canyon walls, that anyone who entered the canyon would disappear just as they had disappeared, swallowed by the mountains, taken by the spirits, never to be seen again. People said that the Apache had powerful magic, that they could call on the spirits of the dead, that they could make themselves invisible, that they could kill without being seen or heard, that they were more than human, that they were something else, something supernatural, something that could not be fought or defeated by ordinary means. We did nothing to discourage these stories. We let them grow, let them spread, let them become part of the folklore of the region, because the stories served our purposes, kept people out of our territory, made them afraid to enter our mountains, gave us a reputation that was worth more than any number of warriors, that made our enemies hesitate, that made them think twice before attacking us, that gave us an advantage that we desperately needed as the tide of white settlement continued to rise and our world continued to shrink. But the victory was temporary, as all our victories were temporary. The whites kept coming, kept pushing into our territory, kept taking our land. The war between the Apache and the Americans intensified over the next decade, became more brutal and more desperate. Cochise fought them for years, using the dragoons as his fortress, striking and then vanishing, making the Americans pay a terrible price for every mile of territory they took. But eventually, even Cochise had to make peace, had to accept that we could not win, that we were outnumbered and outgunned, that the world we had known was ending and there was nothing we could do to stop it. I fought in many battles after Ghost Canyon, killed many enemies, saw many of my brothers die. I saw Mangus Coloradas, the father of my companion Mangus, murdered by American soldiers under a flag of truce. I saw Victorio die fighting to the last, refusing to surrender, choosing death over reservation life. I saw Geronimo surrender finally in 1886, the last of the great Apache leaders to give up the fight, and I saw him shipped off to Florida as a prisoner of war, where he would spend the rest of his life in captivity, far from the mountains he loved, far from the land that had been his home. I survived. I was forced onto a reservation, had my weapons taken away, had my freedom stripped from me, was made to live in a way that was foreign to everything I had known, everything I had been taught, everything I believed. I watched my people die of disease and despair, watched the young ones forget the old ways, watched our culture and our language and our traditions slowly disappear, eroded by time and by the relentless pressure of the white man's world. But I never forgot Ghost Canyon. I never forgot the 9 days when we hunted 14 men through the dragoons, when we made them disappear one by one, when we created a legend that would outlast us all. I never forgot the faces of the men we killed, never forgot their fear, never forgot the terrible things we did in the name of restoring balance, in the name of avenging our ancestors, in the name of protecting our sacred places. Was it right? Was it justified? Was it necessary? I have spent my entire life thinking about these questions, and I still do not have answers that satisfy me. I know that the miners committed a terrible sacrilege, that they desecrated our sacred places, that they showed no respect for our dead or for our beliefs. I know that in our culture, in our understanding of the world, what they did demanded a response, demanded vengeance, demanded that balance be restored. I know that we believed we were acting not out of personal hatred, but out of spiritual necessity, that we were instruments of the spirits, that we were doing what had to be done to maintain the cosmic order. But I also know that we killed 14 men, that we made them suffer, that we terrorized them and hunted them and showed them no mercy. I know that some of them were young, that some of them probably did not fully understand what they were doing when they looted the burial site, that some of them might have been good men who made a terrible mistake. I know that their families mourned them, that their deaths caused pain and suffering to people who had nothing to do with the desecration, that the cycle of violence and revenge that we participated in brought nothing but more death and more suffering to everyone involved. I am an old man now, one of the last who remembers the old ways, one of the last who can speak the language properly, one of the last who understands the beliefs and the traditions that guided our people for generations. The young people do not know the stories, do not understand what we were or what we lost. They have been taught to be ashamed of being Apache, to think of their ancestors as savages, to believe that the whites brought civilization and progress, and that we should be grateful. But I remember the Dragoon Mountains as they were before the whites came, before the mines and the roads and the towns, before our sacred places were violated and our people were scattered, and our way of life was destroyed. I remember Ghost Canyon and the 9 days when we hunted 14 men, when we made them disappear, when we created a legend that would outlast us all. I remember the faces of my companions, Naicha and Geronimo and Ju and Victorio and Nana and Mangas, all of them dead now, all of them gone, all of them remembered only by me and by the stories that are told about them, stories that are often wrong, that are often exaggerated, that often miss the truth of who they were and what they did and why they did it. The whites have their version of the story, and in their version, Ghost Canyon is haunted, cursed, a place where the spirits of the dead take revenge on the living, a place where men disappear without explanation, swallowed by the mountains, taken by supernatural forces. And perhaps they are right in their own way. Perhaps the canyon is haunted, not by the ghosts of the miners, but by the spirits of the Apache ancestors who were disturbed, who demanded vengeance, who will never rest peacefully as long as their sacred places are violated and their descendants are scattered and their culture is forgotten. I go to Ghost Canyon sometimes when I can slip away from the reservation, when I can make the journey to the Dragoons without being stopped by the authorities who do not want Indians wandering off the reservation. I go there and I stand in the place where we killed those 14 men, and I pray to the spirits of my ancestors, asking them to forgive us for what we did, asking them to forgive the miners for what they did, asking them to bring peace to all the dead, Apache and white alike, asking them to heal the wounds that were opened in that terrible spring of 1861. And sometimes, when the wind blows through the canyon in a certain way, when the shadows fall just right, when the boundary between this world and the next grows thin, I think I can hear them, the voices of the dead, Apache and white all mixed together, all crying out for something that I cannot give them, for peace or for justice or for understanding or for forgiveness. I think I can hear the miners screaming as they died, and I think I can hear my ancestors singing the old songs, and I think I can hear Cochise speaking in his quiet, powerful voice, telling me that what we did was necessary, that it was right, that it was the only way to restore the balance. But I do not know if I believe him anymore. I do not know if there is any such thing as balance, or if there is only an endless cycle of violence and revenge, of desecration and retribution, of wounds that can never heal and debts that can never be paid. I do not know if what we did in Ghost Canyon was justice, or if it was just more violence, just more death, just more suffering added to the great mountain of suffering that is human history. I am Gray Fox, nephew of Cochise, and I am the last witness to the ghost trail, to the 9 days when we hunted 14 men through the Dragoon Mountains and made them disappear, to the legend that grew from those 9 days and that still haunts these canyons, to the moment when we showed the white men that there are some places that are sacred, some boundaries that should not be crossed, some prices that are too high to pay for silver or gold or any treasure that the earth might hold. This was not a battle. This was a haunting. This was a message written in blood and fear and disappearance. And the message was simple: respect the dead or join them. Respect the sacred or face the consequences. Understand that there are forces in this world that are beyond your comprehension, beyond your control, beyond your ability to fight or to defeat. The whites did not learn this lesson. They continued to violate our sacred places, continued to take our land, continued to destroy our culture, continued to treat us as obstacles to be removed, rather than as human beings with rights and beliefs, and a connection to this land that went back thousands of years. And so the cycle of violence continued, the wars continued, the suffering continued, until finally we were defeated and broken and scattered, until our sacred places were desecrated beyond repair, until our culture was nearly destroyed, until we were reduced to living on reservations dependent on the government, our pride gone, our independence gone, our way of life gone. But the mountains remember. The Dragoons remember. Ghost Canyon remembers. And as long as there is one person left who knows the true story, as long as there is one person left who can tell what really happened in that canyon in the spring of 1861, The memory will survive, the legend will continue, the message will endure. I am that person. I am the last witness. And I tell this story not because I am proud of what we did, but because it must be told, because the world must know that we were not savages, that we had our own understanding of the sacred, that we had our own reasons for what we did, that we were trying to protect something that mattered more to us than our own lives, something that connected us to our ancestors and to the land and to the cosmos itself. I ask only that you remember that we were here, that this land was ours, that we had a culture and a religion and a way of life that was as valid and as meaningful as any other, that we loved this land and fought for it and died for it. I ask that you remember Ghost Canyon and the 14 miners who disappeared there, and the 7 Apache warriors who made them disappear, and the sacred burial site that started it all, and the cycle of violence and revenge that consumed us all. I ask that you remember that every culture has its own understanding of the sacred, its own way of dealing with death, its own beliefs about the relationship between the living and the dead. What we did may seem barbaric to you, may seem like senseless violence, but to us it was necessary. It was sacred. It was the only way to restore what had been broken, to heal what had been wounded, to avenge what had been desecrated. The whites have their laws and their courts and their prisons, and they believe that their way of justice is the only way, the right way, the civilized way. But we had our own laws, our own understanding of justice, our own way of maintaining balance between the living and the dead, between the physical world and the spiritual world. And when the miners desecrated our burial site, they violated our laws, they upset the cosmic balance, and they had to pay the price. Not because we hated them, but because the universe demanded it, because the spirits required it, because there was no other way to restore what had been broken. I do not expect you to understand. I do not expect you to agree. I only ask that you remember that we were here, that we had our own way of seeing the world, that we had our own connection to the sacred, and that what we did made sense within our understanding of the cosmos, even if it seems incomprehensible to you. The mountains remember, the spirits remember, and I remember, and as long as one person remembers, the story survives, the legend continues, the message endures. This was the story of Gray Fox of the Chiricahua Apache, nephew of Cochise. These are the histories that are not written in the school books. If you were moved by this testament and believe these voices must be heard, please take a moment to honor their legacy. Like this video to help it reach others, subscribe to Tribal Lore to ensure you don't miss another chapter of our shared past, and most importantly, leave a comment below. Tell us what part of this story resonated with you, or suggest a piece of history you believe we should uncover next. Your engagement is the fire that keeps these stories alive. Thank you for listening.